Egypt in turmoil again. The death toll continues to rise as the military moves to break up the sit-ins by pro-Morsi protesters. The Muslim Brotherhood is accused of starting the crisis. But will the crackdown end in violence? And is Egypt returning to military rule? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Stephen Cole. Egyptian security forces have used bulldozers and tear gas to clear one of the main sites of the supporters of ousted President Morsi, and they've surrounded another. Figures vary on the numbers killed, but hundreds have been injured. A state of emergency has been imposed for a month. The demonstrators have been occupying the area since Morsi was deposed on July the 3rd. Well, this was the scene in Nada Square, the smaller of two camps, where police cleared protesters after moving in at 7 o'clock in the morning. Some protesters have since returned to the outskirts. And this was Nasser City, where protesters camped out at Rabba al-Adiro Mosque. Makeshift hospitals were struggling to cope with a number of injured and killed. Protesters had been getting ready for a security crackdown last month. Egypt's army chief, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, called on Egyptians to give him a mandate to confront terrorism, which was perceived at the time as a veiled threat against pro-Morsi protesters.
I ask that all honest and trustworthy Egyptians come out on the streets. But why come out? I ask that they come out to give me the mandate and order that I need to confront violence and potential terrorism.
Well, General el-Sisi is seen as a divisive figure in Egypt, a national hero to some, a reminder of military rule for others. But could he be a future leader of Egypt? Despite an interim president and a prime minister, it's Sisi who has become the face of the government since Mohamed Morsi was deposed. The general has laid out a roadmap for Egypt's transition to civilian rule. And though he says he has no personal ambition to run for president, many observers say Sisi is now the most popular figure in Egyptian politics. But opponents of military rule say the intentions of the government are clear. On Tuesday, 15 of 25 governors appointed by the government were generals. Critics say that's a return to a Mubarak-era strategy of appointing governors with security backgrounds. Mohammed al-Beltaghi is a leading figure in the Muslim Brotherhood. Earlier on Wednesday, his daughter was killed in Nasser City. He told the media that Egypt's army chief was dragging the country into a state of civil war.
The bloody coup must come to an end. I swear to Almighty God, if you remain at home, that Abdel Fattah el-Sisi will turn Egypt into another Syria. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi will turn Egypt into a civil war. Now you must take to the street to clearly declare that the military coup has come to an end and the role of the military machine has come to an end. An institution that is killing its people cannot deserve to remain in power.
For more on all of this, I'm joined by our three guests. From Washington, D.C., Graham Bannerman, scholar at the Middle East Institute and a former analyst with the U.S. State Department. From London, Sharif Nashabibi, Middle East analyst and columnist for Gulf News and Middle East Magazine. And joining us here in Doha, Bashir Abdel Fattah, editor-in-chief of Al-Ahram Democracy Review. Let's begin with Graham Bannerman in Washington, D.C. Graham, there has been considerable violence clearing the sit-ins. Is this the beginning of a longer confrontation, or do you see it as a violent precursor to a more secure Cairo, a more secure Egypt, which is what people say they want?
It's impossible to tell at this moment in the middle of a situation like this. One has to be very disappointed that events have come to this violence and that they could not have resolved their differences through negotiations and peaceful means. That said, Egypt now faces a very difficult period where security becomes a key issue, and clearly the interim government will try to impose security on the country so a political process can begin. Whether they can succeed or not is not clear.
Sharif in London, is it all this happening because the Muslim Brotherhood got it wrong. They blew their chance at government, either because Egyptians lost confidence in their ability to govern, or they underestimated the will of the military?
Well, I mean, I think Morsi should have called early elections because, according to a poll at the time, the majority of Egyptians wanted this, including Al-Azhar, the Sunni Muslim authority in Egypt, and the Salafist Noor party, and his government was imploding. So it was in Egypt's national interest to call early elections. Having said that, I have been deeply concerned from the outset at how the military has behaved and how it has been supported by a large element of the population against another large proportion of the population. And everything we've seen since the overthrow of Morsi has been leading to increased violence. It's leading to exactly what the military said it wanted to avoid in moving against Morsi. We are now seeing wholesale violence in Egypt and effectively a crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood. This is not going to lead to a stable Egypt, quite on the contrary.
Bashir Abdel Fattah, the government says it'll continue with a roadmap it's drawn up, a roadmap that doesn't, the government says, exclude any party. So how will the Muslim Brotherhood receive that message?
In my poor opinion, I think there is a gap between the statements of the interim administration of Egypt now and the measures they take. Really, there is an exclusion to the Muslim Brotherhood and many of other Islamic movements in the political arena in Egypt after Morsi. Although a Noor Salafist party agreed to join the alliance that lead the country after Morsi, but I think the public opinion, or most of the public opinion, and the liberal and the nationalist political actors in Egypt refuse to join or to include the Muslim Brotherhood and some other Islamic political movements to join them in the political arena or in the political process. So I think there is a gap between the statements and the measures, and the Muslim Brotherhood know that if they finish their groping and demonstrations, they will be arrested, especially the leaders of Muslim Brotherhood. You are suffering in Egypt from a gap of confidence, lack of confidence between the political actors, so nobody trusted the other. Muslim Brotherhood, they have the choice between to be jailed or to be on power. So this is really a critical problem in Egypt now.
Graham Bannerman in Washington, D.C., this is a major reversal, isn't it, for the Arab Spring? How did Egypt's revolution perhaps differ from others in the region?
Well, the Arab Spring was a created term that explained things that were changing in the region. I think Egypt is still going through a transition, and the question that's still open is, will Egypt be able to get to a stable democratic form of government that represents the people without the military being in charge? And I think that's the struggle that's going on here. I think the majority of Egyptians saw the Muslim Brotherhood government under President Morsi having strayed from the path towards representation, and there needed to be a corrective course. I don't think the majority would want to have seen the violence we've seen, but they believe that they need new elections and new participation from all parties. Whether this happens or not is unclear, but the hope can be that after we get through the emotions of the moment, that the people of Egypt can pull together and move forward in a political process that really is representative of all the people.
Sharif, is there a cruel lesson for Egyptians here in that they thought removing long-standing authoritarian rule was going to be a lot easier than replacing it with perhaps another system of governance?
Yes, it has certainly proved to be much more difficult, not just in Egypt, but in the region generally. I think one of the major lessons that the Muslim Brotherhood will see from this whole episode is that it is futile to engage in the political democratic process. To Islamist groups in Egypt and in other countries in the region, they will see that, what is the point of entering the political process when at any given time the military can just sweep us from power. And this is a very dangerous precedent to send, because this will tempt some people to revert back to the violent methods that used to take place in Egypt and in other countries. It will drive elements underground. It may split, the Muslim Brotherhood may fracture into more radicalized elements. And already we are seeing increased violence in Egypt. And this is indeed the lesson. I mean, you know, there is a tinkering of the democratic process in Egypt, which is very dangerous. And we simply don't know the full extent of the repercussions as yet.
And was the general assumption, do you think, Sharif, that freeing Arab countries from autocracy would automatically herald democracy?
Well, I think in the euphoria of the moment, people were probably simplistic in how much they thought could change and in how little time. I mean, I've written for quite a long time that people need to temper their expectations, that we are talking about the reinventing of societies and infrastructures and nations. And this is going to take a very long time, and it's going to be a very bumpy process. I think people, you know, obviously, quite understandably, they are so frustrated with all the decades of dictatorship and stagnation in the region that they want change quickly, and I understand that. But that's simply not realistic. I mean, it's going to be a very long, drawn-out process. But certainly it's very worrying that what we're seeing in Egypt is a reversal of the progress that we should be hoping for.
Well, indeed. Bashar Abdel Fattah, Mohammed al-Baltagi is a leading figure, as you know, in the Muslim Brotherhood. He suffered a big tragedy. His daughter was killed in Nasser City. After hearing the news, he said the army was dragging the country into a state of civil war. Now, is that a reflection of a generally held view amongst the Muslim Brotherhood?
Yes, here in Egypt now we have two dilemmas. The first one, the relationship between the military and politics, and also the relationship between Islamic movements and politics as well. Those are the two dilemmas of Egypt after Mubarak, really. Muslim Brotherhood thinks that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the leader of the Egyptian army, was responsible for what they call the military coup against the democratic elected president Mohammed Morsi. And now everybody, or every team of the conflict now in Egypt, or of the crisis in Egypt now, he didn't leave any stage or any space for the other side in order to get back one step or two steps in order to reach a compromise. So Mr. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi now is afraid that he might be asked if Dr. Morsi come back, because he will be responsible for a military coup. In the same time, Muslim Brotherhood leaders are afraid that if the military coup succeeded, they will be jailed. So nobody leave a space for the other side in order to get back or to back off one or two steps in order to reach a compromise.
Graham Bannerman, a state of emergency across Egypt for a month. The army says it will support security across the country. The violence had been largely localized to Cairo, but it does seem to be spreading across the country now. Graham Bannerman, how do you think other governments will be reacting when they look at the scenes from Egypt?
I think everybody's going to be concerned with this amount of violence that's occurring in Egypt. But when you look at the choices the interim government had, there was really no choice but a state of emergency until order is restored. And that's going to take a while. I would hope, and I think most outside observers would hope, that this would be a temporary situation where the order is restored in Cairo and the country can get on. The problem faced by the interim government was the continuing demonstrations were a complete block on any political or economic progress in the country. It was untenable to continue the demonstrations without doing irreparable harm to Egypt. And so the government faced an untenable choice. Either we use force from the internal security forces to remove the demonstrations and begin the political process and the economic process, or we don't. Anybody who knew if they did that there would be violence and it would continue for some time. Nobody wanted that, but the government really had a very difficult decision to face.
Do you see this as I mean, some say it's a dangerous polarization now in Egypt, Graham, and the absence of a willingness to compromise across the country?
I think that you've seen that over the last 6 weeks is a polarization between the Muslim Brotherhood and the communities at large. There have been a complete disconnect between these two groups. Their worldview is different. Their view of the future of Egypt is different. That is the thing that's been worrisome. Instead of the divisions being smaller over the last 6 weeks, they've become greater and more rigid. And that's what's most frightening about the future of Egypt.
And Bashir, you must come in here because there's no doubt the army in Egypt is a respected institution. Credible opinion polls I was looking at today suggest less than a quarter of Egyptians now support the Brotherhood. Do you recognise that demographic?
People in Egypt used to be ruled by the military since 1952, and people are accustomed to that. I think we cannot ignore the rule or the political rule of the military in the Egyptian politics, because you have a weak civilian elite in Egypt. So everybody trusted the military so much, and there are many studies in the last few years said that the military can play a vital role as a guardian for democratization in the Arab countries because of the absence of the civilian, democratic civilian elite in those countries. So I think the military can play a vital role in democratization in Egypt, but it needs a deal between the military and the leaders of the civilian elite in Egypt, without ignoring the Muslim Brotherhood or any other Islamic movement. We need a deal, negotiation between the military and civilians in order to keep democratization by the support of the military in our country.
So reduce the polarization, in other words. The Muslim Brotherhood, as you know, won elections, but did they then, and that's the accusation, fail to persuade millions of Egyptians that their policies were inclusive?
I think Muslim Brotherhood proved that they can play an important role in the opposition, but in ruling the country, the presidency or the government, I think they proved that they failed to do that. They were in a hurry when they accepted to go in a conflict with the Egyptian state as a whole, the military and the judiciary and the police as well. So I think they have to make some sort of self-criticism. This is very important for Muslim Brotherhood, and the popularity of the group is now getting down because of the bad political performance in office in the last year. So I think we need in Egypt now self-criticism for everybody, especially Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic movements in our country.
Sharif Nashabeli in London, do you think now there's any likelihood of outside Arab mediation?
Well, there might be attempts, but I think any attempt at mediation is, at least in the short term, seemingly futile. I mean, the way that the new authorities have dealt with the situation since the overthrow of Morsi has made it increasingly difficult. At the beginning, you had the Salafist Noor Party, which is a major component of the Islamist camp in Egypt, willing to cooperate with them. But fairly soon after, withdrew that cooperation because of the heavy-handed tactics of the authorities. Al-Azhar institution has also distanced itself from its actions. And just recently, there was a delegation of Morsi supporters, of senior figures, who met with the new authorities and expressed a willingness an initiative to find a common ground and to find a political solution. Now, these kind of massacres which we're seeing, and let's make no mistake, this is a massacre that's going on. This doesn't help. This is absolutely contrary to any kind of political solution. And where we had been seeing elements of the Muslim Brotherhood trying to be more pragmatic and saying, okay, let's work out a deal. This is not going to happen now, not for a very long time, and not as long as the new authorities continue to act in a way. We have Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International consistently condemning the indiscriminate, excessive, targeted use of force against a largely civilian protest movement.
Well,
and this is not acceptable. It's completely counterproductive to a political solution.
That's a very interesting point. Graham Bannerman, will there, do you think, be a degree of celebration in Washington, Jerusalem, some other capitals, that the army is back in control and the Muslim Brotherhood is out of government? After all, Washington very clearly hesitated to use the word coup. Well, they didn't hesitate, they didn't use the word coup. And that has drawn accusations from the pro-Morsi camp that the US was in some way compliant or complicit in what happened.
Well, let me say, first of all, the United States has been able to alienate all sides in Egypt, and I don't think the United States' position has ever been more disliked by all Egyptians than it is today. Now, Washington, to be in fairness, does not want the situation to be what it is today. It does not want the military to be the government. They believe the long-term interest in Egypt is to have free and fair elections, a new parliament, a new president, and to move forward in the process, and the army should give up whatever authority it has as quickly as possible. That is the American position, and they're consistent in that. Now, are there individuals in Washington who believe it's good that the Army's in power? Absolutely. But there's also individuals in Washington who believe the Army is the source of all problems. The official position is we want democratic, free elections as quickly as possible and have this transition as short as possible.
All right, well, let's go to Bashar and look at the future, Bashar, because Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, we've seen a couple of times during this program his picture, his poster, Egypt's top general. He's very much in the spotlight, isn't he, now? Do you see him running for president? After all, there's nothing to stop him from doing so if he resigns from the army.
Although the man denied this in his press dialogue with the Washington Post newspaper, but I think this man is thinking in this choice, because many Egyptians now are asking for that after they discovered that they cannot be ruled very well by a civilian president. The mentality of the Egyptians till now cannot accept or imagine that a president from the civilian elite. Everybody he is in Egypt trusted the military till now. They have good administration and their patriotism and so on. So I think that al-Sisi is thinking very well of that, but it depends how the actions and the political arena will be in the next few months.
Sharif, could Egypt one day wake up to President al-Sisi?
Well, it looks like it's headed that way. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Egypt has been under military rule since the overthrow of Morsi. Now, with the declaration today of the state of emergency, it is now officially under military rule. And yeah, at the moment, you know, he is riding a wave of popularity that could see him running for president. But, you know, we have to be very careful here. The Egyptian public opinion towards the military changes like the weather. Right now, its most ardent supporters were its most vocal critics after the fall of Mubarak because of their reluctance to hand over power to civilian authorities. So the military and Sisi in particular have to be very, very careful about how they play this. If they overplay their hand, they might see a resurgence of a popular movement against them, which is not led by the supporters of Morsi.
Well, certainly opinions could turn against the army again if it fails to fix the economy. But Graham Bannerman, lastly, how do you read the army's long-term intentions now?
Well, long-term intentions change, but the Army has been very clear since January of 2011 that they viewed Egypt as moving towards a civilian government where the Army does not govern or rule. That has been their intention, and that has been their objective. They have stated it clearly and consistently. And even Field Marshal Tantawi was clear that he wanted to see a civilian government, and they supported Morsi as he came to power, even though they probably didn't favor his candidacy because they saw that a step in that direction. I think they saw their actions they took on July 3rd as a way to redirect the revolution. I don't think they thought they were taking over. I don't think they wanted to take over. I don't think that was their intent. But as events occur, and as the other speakers have said, is the longer they stay there and the more the popular opinion says you are the only ones to do that, the fear is they'll begin to believe that and want to stay in power. I think that would be a mistake and unfortunate for Egypt in the long run and unfortunate for the army in the long run.
Lastly, Sharif, very briefly, in just 1 or 2 seconds, what do you think the general's long-term intentions are? Briefly, if you would.
From past experience, they want to maintain and entrench their rule, whether directly or indirectly. It remains to be seen how overt that power will be in Egypt.
All right. Thanks for that. Thanks to all my guests, Graham Bannerman, Sharif Nashabibi and Basha Abdel Fattah.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. From me, Stephen Cole, goodbye for now.